It's an exciting day for our football program to have an opportunity to welcome 21 student athletes to our program, to our campus, and in our community. I think our staff has done a tremendous job making sure that we identify the right kid to bring to UMD, to the city of Duluth, and we're excited to welcome this class in. I think it was certainly a class that we started to identify probably back in last January to make sure that we're going to address the future needs of our football program. And with any football program, that's a kind of an ever-moving target. And I think our class with the early signing date, every class kind of takes on its own personality. Every recruiting class, some come relatively quick, some come relatively late. And I think our program, for the most part, continues to try to do the right thing and make sure we're getting the right background and the right kid and the right fit for UMD football. And sometimes we're a little bit slower in that process, and that's intentionally. And we wanted to make sure that we secured the right kids for this class. And you look at the class that we signed, we certainly had some needs in our secondary, positionally at safety and at corner, and I think we did a really good job addressing that along with our offensive line and the future needs. And when we look at addressing the future needs of our football program, it's probably a year or two out, and our plan for most of these guys is going to be to try to redshirt these guys, get their feet underneath them academically and adjust to the college life, and then move forward, certainly for the next year.
Curt, who could you potentially see possibly not redshirting?
Well, potentially any of them. I think athletically most of these guys are probably going to be ready to go, but again, we attempt to always have a year out and a year gap where we're going to have an immediate need for an incoming freshman. But maybe somebody in our secondary is a spot that we could take a look at a guy playing immediately for us. I think generally guys up front, offensive and defensive linemen, tight end bodies, those guys are probably need a year or two in the weight room to be ready to go. But skill guys sometimes can come in and play. I think we're probably deep enough at the receiver position this year with upperclassmen that we can hold these guys, and I think athletically we addressed our future needs with the athleticism in this class with our wide receiver position.
Specifically about Brandon and Tim, what is it about those two, not their primary position in the secondary, to come in, and what is it about them athletically, mentally, that you hope, maybe gives them the possibility to play that different position?
Yeah, you look at both these guys. They're team captains. They're multiple sport athletes. They're leaders in their community. And those guys for us are slam dunks. Not every kid is the right fit for UMD, and UMD is not the right fit for every kid. And we want to make sure, certainly local talent like this and tremendous kids, that we have an opportunity to get these kids to UMD. And so that's probably, Zach, the first thing that we look at both these guys is they're multiple sport athletes. They're gym rats. They're in athletics for the right reasons. They're good students, and both those guys are excited to be on campus for us. So when you transition maybe quarterbacks of the secondary, or a guy like Brandon that's played multiple positions, and it may take a year for these guys to develop where they need to be because they haven't necessarily maybe been fine-tuned at a certain spot. But I think both these guys have a really high ceiling athletically and certainly mentally for us in our program.
Was that a sell for you? We can ask them once they get here or in the next year or so, but was that a sell for a guy like Tim who's played quarterback did you have to talk him into wanting to move into the secondary, or is that just where he fits in the college game?
Yeah, well, I think he fits into our scheme that way. We ended up with Keegan Kalcher at the quarterback position. We talked to Tim the whole time about this, that if things didn't work out with Keegan, that maybe we could bring him in at the quarterback spot. I think he's a guy who can play multiple spots for us. And again, you look at where our need is in the future here. We need to address our safety position, and both he and Brandon are guys. Brandon, we're probably going to start out at corner, and Tim at the safety position. But both those guys can transition there, and it may take them a little bit of time, but they'll be ready to go. And with both these guys, when you're playing multiple sports, they're not used to an off-season training at a college level, so these guys will develop quick.
What kind of steered you with Tim that he's maybe more projected as a safety? He's a dual threat guy in high school, and that kind of fits your style for a quarterback. What kind of steered you that projecting him as a safety?
I guess honestly, it was our needs. I think he can play earlier at that position, and athletically, mentally, Tim's a guy that we had in team camp for a couple of years. He's been on campus a lot. We know a lot about him and have worked with him and had an opportunity to see him interact with his teammates, interact with his coaches, interact in the city of Cloquet. So he's a guy that can lead in our secondary. And for us, a guy like Tim is a slam dunk. We're excited to have an opportunity to work with him.
The class that you signed last year, Coach, whenever we get to this point, that's where last year's class kind of takes a step forward. We were sitting here last year and you were really excited about the kids you brought in last year, so how excited are you to get them, most of them on the field for the first time now?
Yeah, we're still excited about that class, which is a great thing. I think we had a great group of guys that redshirted for us this year. Some of those guys didn't redshirt for us this year. Justice King played for us this year and played corner for us, but that group will certainly be in the rotation for us this fall. So they've had a year in the weight room now. Right now they're going through an off season. We're excited to kind of get those guys out from being a freshman and transition them onto the field and intermix with the rest of our team this spring. So they're a great group, and again, those guys haven't necessarily fit into our scheme quite yet, and they're going to this spring. So their job in the weight room here for the next month and a half, and once the snow's off the turf, we'll have to see those guys transition into our schemes.
Coach, some of these eight D-backs are pretty accomplished at QB and wide receiver. What did you see in them that projected them as D-backs here at UMD?
Well, usually a guy that's a good ball carrier, certainly at the wide receiver position, can project into being a good safety and or corner. And then if you look at guys that are quarterbacks for us, and we brought, I think, 3 guys that were quarterbacks that are going to play in the secondary for us, those guys should be natural leaders. They've had the pressure on them. They've had an opportunity to call a game. They've had an opportunity to stand in front of a huddle. And at our safety or corner position, those are guys that are going to need to be able to step into the college level and do the same thing. So whenever you can recruit leaders, guys that are multiple sport athletes, guys that probably have not peaked at this point in their athletic career, those guys are the guys that we're going to target. And I think all those guys, certainly guys that have played on the offense side and had success, can usually transition onto the defense side. And some of those guys play defense as well. So, we've seen those guys tackle and run around. A guy like Tim's a guy that was mainly a quarterback, but, seeing him move around at camp and athletically, Gladowski, same thing out of Amherst, both those guys, they'll transition and do fine in the secondary.
Your class is made up mostly of Minnesotans, Wisconsinites, and Iowans, but you do have a kid from Nevada. Can you just talk about what went into recruiting him?
Yeah, usually we try to stay in our backyard. Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, those are generally where we're going to attempt to recruit, and that's where we put the majority of our resources in. Shamir Thomas's brother played here. Chaz Thomas played here, I believe, in 2008 through 2012. He's a tailback for us. So, ironically, I saw Chaz on Twitter say something about his brother. Shot him a text and I said, hey, I don't know anything about this guy, why not? And he said check out his film, and 2 weeks later we had him on campus and committed. So sometimes it's family connection, and usually if we're going to recruit nationwide, it's through a connection and to make sure that we're getting the right kid.
This whole class as a whole, 21 kids, is there anything they have in common besides being future Bulldogs that really stands out? Is there a way to sum up this class for this season?
Well, I think, again, we're sometimes a little bit slower in the recruiting process as a staff, and we do that intentionally. So I think if you look at all 21 of these guys, we've done our background on these guys. I think if there's one thing that's in common, I think we have great people in this class, and certainly students as well. And to get into school here, these guys need to be good students, and that's a bonus for us, right? So by the time these guys get here, academically they're prepared, athletically they're prepared, and it's our job as football coaches to evaluate them as people through the recruiting process. And I think that's one thing that if you look at this class as a whole, all 21 guys, we feel good about their personality and commitment coming in.
Is this the equivalent of draft the best player, where you guys are taking maybe the best athletes and the guys that play multiple sports and then fitting them into what you want them to do versus maybe taking what they did in high school and translating it? Yeah, well, drafting players would be a lot easier because then we don't have to recruit players. So, but yes, I think certainly when you recruit kids, and we have an opportunity again to look at these guys in April and May and June, July, all the way through summer, and then evaluate their senior film. We have an opportunity not only to see these guys move around and athletically, but to be able to coach these guys and see them being coached by other coaches. I think that's an important thing for us to see how they're going to interact with our staff. It's the right fit both ways. And again, I think as you look at the draft, you got to make sure that you're drafting the right guy to fit your scheme, and that's what we've done with these young men. not a recruiting question, but quarterback-wise, do you expect all three of those guys from last year to be healthy in time for spring ball, or are you waiting on one or two for fall camp?
We do. Mike is still rehabbing. Mike had a shoulder injury last fall, so he'll practice with us this spring, but probably in a limited fashion. So John and Ben will both be back, along with Garrett Olson, who we redshirted last year. So we'll have three guys healthy and competing, and Mike will be back eventually for next fall, but it's taking a little bit of time. He had a serious shoulder injury, so it's going to take him a little bit of time to get back.
Is that competition reset now? I mean, obviously they all had tape from last year, but I mean, is it probably back to where we started last year, where the job's anybody's to take?
Well,
spring ball?
maybe, possibly, right? I think at any position, those guys need to continue to compete. We're in a really fortunate situation that we're in the same situation as we were last year, that now I know we have three guys that can play, three guys that can win football games for us. So I'm excited to see those guys compete. I think the one thing about our football program, and these guys were the epitome of it, all three of these guys at one point were injured. All three of those guys continued to support the other guy that was on the field to make sure that we were prepared and we were ready to win on Saturday afternoon. So I have a lot of respect for all three of these guys. I'm excited to continue to work with them.
Bradley Walt was a first-team All-State punter for Wisconsin. Do you have any plans on using him at punter at all?
Yeah, I think whenever you're looking at, you look at Trent Tater too. Trent was a long snapper out of Maple Grove. So whenever you have an opportunity to look at a guy that can snap or long snap, short snap or punt or kick, one of the four, we'll certainly look at those guys in the future, as they come here. But we recruited Brad to be a linebacker for us, and if he can punt, that's a bonus. Certainly from time to time we do some funny things in special teams. We may fake a punt or two. So if you get a guy that can run like Brad, maybe we'll use him at punter as well.
Curt, I don't recall a class with so many defensive backs, but just one defensive lineman, two linebackers is all. What with this year's roster had you confident you didn't need to bring more guys in up front?
Yeah, again, when we're looking at addressing the needs, it's really probably a year out. So we're relatively deep on our defensive line right now, but we may not be in a year or two. So that's the reason for bringing in one defensive lineman, and I think Logan Hendrickson he's a difference maker for us. He's a special player, extremely athletic. He's long, and again, I think he's a guy that can project extremely high as far as the ceiling. He hasn't peaked as an athlete. So same thing in our secondary. I think right now if we feel that our team in our secondary, we feel pretty good, but in a year or two we may not. So these guys, we're young back there right now in a couple spots, and we're thin in a couple spots. So that's why we signed as many defensive backs as we did, to make sure we can address the needs probably a year out. But again, I think maybe the corner position is a spot that potentially one of these young guys could come in and compete and play for us this fall.
Another thing you need is a special teams coordinator. How close are you to making that signing?
Yeah, we certainly have a hole to fill there. Coach Bauer did a good job for us. So I'm hoping in the next 2 weeks that we'll have 3 weeks that we'll have somebody on board to fill that spot and be our secondary coach. And special teams coordinator, we're going to work through that process here, and we may do things a little bit differently, just given our staff structure. And, for me, I want to make sure we're hiring the best person, number one, and then number two, hiring the best coach. And, we're going to narrow things down here pretty quickly and have somebody on campus and make sure that we get the right fit for our program. And then as far as staff structure and who's calling those plays, for me, that's probably number two. We got to get the right guy and get the right personality fit back there for those guys first.
We expect any changes in special teams? Are they you mentioned the fake punts and all the fun stuff you guys have done. Is that just a hallmark at UMD now, or was that Greg's little flavor?
Greg did a great job, certainly, being diverse on special teams. We can't tip anything off for Minot too early, so there's a chance that we adjust things in special teams, but offensively, defensively, we may be adjusting things as well, so you never know.